In this episode, we're going to turn the question of which validation path to use into something you can answer with calm confidence instead of nervous guessing. Beginners often hear people talk about different paths as if they are secret categories you only learn after years in the field, and that creates a lot of unnecessary anxiety. The truth is that the path decision follows a small set of logical rules tied to risk, complexity, and how the organization handles cardholder data. If you understand those rules, you can look at an environment description and quickly tell whether a self-assessment route is appropriate, whether a formal assessor-led route is required, and what kinds of evidence expectations will follow from that choice. This matters because choosing the wrong path can waste time, create gaps in reporting, or lead to misunderstandings with stakeholders who rely on the validation outcome. When you can select the right path confidently, you show that you understand how the PCI ecosystem scales validation to match real-world conditions, which is exactly the kind of practical judgment the QSA role is meant to represent. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first thing to anchor is what these paths are actually doing in the larger PCI picture, because that clears away a lot of confusion. Validation paths exist to demonstrate alignment with the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI DSS, which sets expectations for protecting cardholder data environments. Different organizations have different risk profiles, transaction volumes, and technical complexity, and the ecosystem needs more than one way to validate compliance, so that smaller, simpler environments are not forced into the same burden as large, complex ones. The Self-Assessment Questionnaire (SAQ) path is generally designed for organizations that can validate compliance through a structured questionnaire approach, while the Report on Compliance, ROC path, is a more formal assessment report typically associated with environments that require deeper evaluation. Both paths still rely on evidence, and both are meant to be defensible, but they differ in structure, detail, and the typical level of assessor involvement. The Attestation of Compliance, AOC, is a related reporting artifact that accompanies validation outcomes, serving as a formal statement that the organization has completed the relevant validation process. Once you see these as different ways to produce trusted proof, rather than as arbitrary labels, the decision logic becomes easier to follow. A key mindset shift for beginners is recognizing that the path decision is not a popularity contest and not a preference the organization can simply declare. Organizations often want the easiest route, and they may describe their environment in a way that supports that desire, but the validation path should reflect the true data flow and true scope. That means the first step in selecting the right path is not memorizing a list of questionnaire types, but understanding the environment's payment channels, how card data is handled, and how the cardholder data environment, CDE boundaries, are enforced. If cardholder data touches many systems, if segmentation is weak, or if operational workflows create many exception paths, then a more formal validation route may be appropriate because the risk and complexity are higher. If the environment is truly minimal, tightly controlled, and designed so that cardholder data exposure is limited, a questionnaire-based validation may be appropriate because the security story is easier to confirm and document. This is why earlier skills like scoping and data flow tracing matter so much here, because path selection is a downstream consequence of those foundational truths. Confident selection comes from using those truths as your guide rather than being swayed by convenience. To make the decision feel concrete, think of validation path selection as a question of how much assurance the ecosystem needs and how much complexity exists that could hide problems. In a small environment with a single payment channel, a simple architecture, and a strong strategy for keeping card data out of most systems, the risk of hidden pathways can be lower, and a structured self-assessment can be a reasonable way to demonstrate compliance. In a large environment with multiple payment channels, many locations, multiple third-party integrations, and a wide set of connected systems that could impact the CDE, the risk of blind spots is higher. That higher risk often demands deeper validation, broader evidence review, and more structured reporting, which is where the ROC becomes relevant. Notice that this is not about judging one path as more legitimate than the other. It is about aligning the level of validation effort with the level of risk and complexity. When the path matches the environment, the validation is more meaningful because it is neither too shallow nor unnecessarily heavy. That alignment is what makes the ecosystem workable at scale, and understanding it is part of thinking like a QSA. Now, let's talk about what it means to choose confidently when the environment description is incomplete or messy, because real organizations rarely hand you a perfect summary. Confident selection begins with asking the right environment questions, even if you are not doing a technical deep dive in the moment. You want to know how payments are accepted, such as in-person terminals, e-commerce checkout, call center workflows, or mobile payments, because each channel can create different data paths. You want to know whether the organization stores any cardholder data and whether it uses approaches like tokenization or point-to-point encryption, because those can reduce exposure if implemented correctly. You also want to understand whether the organization relies on third parties for processing or hosting, because that shifts where controls live and what evidence is needed. Finally, you want to understand how boundaries are enforced, such as segmentation strength and administrative access pathways, because weak boundaries can pull more systems into scope. These questions are not about filling out a form. They are about building the minimum accurate story needed to select a validation approach that will stand up later. When you can ask these questions and translate answers into scoping consequences, you can choose a path with precision rather than with guesswork. A common beginner misunderstanding is treating SAQ selection as a quick classification exercise based on a single feature, like having an outsourced payment processor. Outsourcing can reduce exposure, but it does not automatically remove the merchant from responsibility or guarantee that the merchant environment is simple. For example, an e-commerce site might outsource the payment page, but still host scripts or integrations that bring payment data into the merchant environment if the design is not tight. A retail store might use encrypted terminals, but still have exception processes where staff manually write down card details during outages, creating a separate data flow. The point is that a single outsourcing decision does not define the validation path by itself. The true determinant is the real data flow and the real operational behaviors around it. Confident selection means you do not let a single reassuring phrase, like "we do not store card data," substitute for a verified understanding. It also means you recognize that questionnaire paths often have conditions and assumptions built into them, and if those assumptions are not true, the path may not fit. When you keep that in mind, you avoid the most common cause of wrong path selection, which is believing a simplified story that does not reflect reality. It also helps to understand the relationship between validation path and evidence expectations, because the path you choose should make sense in terms of what you can credibly prove. A questionnaire-based validation still requires evidence, but the evidence story is often framed around confirming that the environment fits a defined profile and that the requirements applicable to that profile are met. A report-based validation usually requires a more detailed evidence narrative because the environment may be complex, the control landscape may involve more variations, and stakeholders may need deeper assurance. If an organization cannot provide clear evidence that supports a clean, minimal scope, that itself is a signal that a simpler validation path might not be appropriate. Conversely, if an organization can provide strong evidence that its environment is tightly controlled and fits a profile that limits exposure, a questionnaire path can be more defensible because the evidence aligns with the assumed simplicity. This is why confidence is not just a feeling. It is a match between environment reality and validation method. When you select a path, you are implicitly selecting an evidence style, and your selection should be able to survive the question, can we prove this credibly? Another place where beginners can get tripped up is confusing the path decision with the QSA's personal involvement, as if one path is always assessor-led and the other is never assessor-led. In practice, organizations can seek help understanding requirements and building evidence readiness, but the validation path still has its own expectations for what must be documented and how results are represented. A QSA needs to remain clear about their role and about what is being validated, because credibility depends on the boundaries between guidance, assessment, and formal reporting. The core confidence skill here is being able to explain to stakeholders what the chosen path means, what it does not mean, and what artifacts will be needed. If stakeholders think an SAQ is a casual checklist, they may underinvest in evidence and process, which leads to fragile validation. If stakeholders think an ROC is purely a technical penetration exercise, they may miss the governance and documentation expectations that make it defensible. When you can communicate the purpose and the evidence burden clearly, you reduce confusion, and you reduce the chance that the organization chooses a path that it is not prepared to support. To choose the right path, you also need to connect the decision to merchant scale and operational consistency, because validation methods assume certain levels of repeatability. An environment with many sites can sometimes still be suitable for a questionnaire approach if the sites are truly standardized, centrally managed, and operate under consistent controls, because standardization reduces the chance that one site behaves differently in a way that affects card data security. On the other hand, an environment with fewer sites can still demand deeper validation if each site is unique, locally managed, and connected in inconsistent ways. This is why smart sampling and evidence strategy matter, because if the organization's story depends on consistency, you need evidence that consistency exists. If there is no consistency, you cannot rely on limited proof without increasing risk. Confident path selection means you can look at the organization's operational model and predict whether the environment will support a validation method that depends on uniformity. When the environment lacks uniformity, the path that demands deeper coverage and richer reporting becomes more appropriate because it is designed to handle variability. Third-party service providers also influence path decisions in subtle ways because they can reduce exposure in some places while creating responsibility complexity in others. If a third party handles processing and the organization's systems truly never touch card data, that can support a simpler validation profile, but only if the organization governs the relationship properly and understands where responsibilities lie. If multiple providers are involved, if integrations are complex, or if administrative access paths cross boundaries, the overall environment can become more complex, even if direct data handling is outsourced. In those cases, the question becomes whether the organization can clearly demonstrate responsibility mapping, access control, incident coordination, and evidence availability across organizational boundaries. If that governance story is immature or unclear, a deeper validation approach may be necessary because the risk of blind spots is higher. Confident selection means you do not treat third-party involvement as automatically simplifying. You treat it as shifting the complexity into governance and integration clarity. When you can see that shift, you can explain why a path is appropriate based on the full security story, not just based on where a processor sits. Because many organizations want to reduce scope aggressively, it is important to recognize that scope reduction strategies and validation paths are linked but not identical. Tokenization and P2PE can reduce the size of the CDE and can therefore influence which validation profile fits. Yet the mere presence of those technologies does not automatically dictate a particular path. What matters is whether the technologies truly remove cardholder data from the broader environment and whether the organization's processes avoid creating exception flows that reintroduce exposure. If scope reduction is real and verifiable, it can support a more streamlined validation method because the environment becomes simpler and more contained. If scope reduction is partial or inconsistent, it can actually make the environment harder to reason about because you have a mix of protected paths and unprotected exceptions. In that mixed world, choosing a path too optimistically can lead to underscoping and weak evidence, which undermines defensibility. Confident selection means you treat scope reduction as a hypothesis to be verified, then you select the path that matches the verified result. This protects you from being seduced by design claims that have not yet been proven in operation. From an exam mindset perspective, questions about choosing SAQ or ROC paths often test whether you understand that the decision must be based on reality, not on preference, and that the decision must be supported by accurate scoping and data flow understanding. Options that assume a path purely because of a single feature, like using a third party, are often weaker because they ignore the possibility of indirect exposure and connected systems that impact security. Options that insist every environment must use the most intensive validation method are also often weaker because the ecosystem is built to scale and because simpler environments can be validated differently when evidence supports that simplicity. Strong options tend to reflect careful judgment. Confirm the payment channels, confirm where card data appears, confirm whether the organization stores or transmits sensitive values, confirm the strength of boundaries, and then select the validation path that fits the resulting scope. If you keep returning to that reasoning chain, you can answer path questions without memorizing a huge set of special cases. The exam is rewarding your ability to connect environment reality to the right validation method, which is exactly what a QSA must do in the field. One final piece of confidence is being prepared to explain, in plain language, why the chosen path is appropriate and what the organization must do to make that path defensible. If you select a questionnaire route, you should be able to explain that it still requires real evidence, that it depends on the environment fitting a specific profile, and that exceptions and hidden data flows can undermine it. If you select a report route, you should be able to explain that it is structured to handle complexity, that it demands deeper evidence and clearer narratives, and that it protects stakeholders by producing a more comprehensive validation story. Confidence is not only internal, it is also the ability to communicate the decision in a way that aligns expectations and reduces conflict. When stakeholders understand the logic, they are more likely to provide accurate information and cooperate with evidence collection, which improves the quality of the validation regardless of path. This communication skill is part of what makes a QSA valuable, because it turns complex compliance choices into clear operational decisions. To conclude, selecting the right SAQ or ROC path confidently is about aligning validation method to the true size and complexity of the cardholder data environment, CDE, based on accurate data flow understanding, boundary strength, and evidence maturity. The Self-Assessment Questionnaire, SAQ, and Report on Compliance, ROC, are different ways to demonstrate alignment with the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI-DSS, and the right choice is driven by risk, variability, and the likelihood of hidden pathways, not by convenience. The Attestation of Compliance, AOC, reflects the formal statement that validation has been completed, and its credibility depends on the integrity of the chosen path. Confident selection comes from asking the right environment questions, verifying scope reduction claims, understanding shared responsibility with third parties, and matching evidence expectations to the validation method. When you can do that, the path decision stops feeling like a mysterious rule and starts feeling like a logical extension of scoping and evidence discipline. That is how you choose a path that not only fits the environment, but also stands up when someone relies on the result.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.